video deal?
Sure, get those ratings there, and then I have security where students can get their access to the grades.
Oh, I did.
Hi everyone. Thank you for coming to the workshop today. We're going to be having a workshop led by Cosette, who is with the Center for Teaching and Learning at the U of A. Cosette did her PhD at the University of Manitoba in Interdisciplinary Studies, Nursing and Education. And I've had the pleasure of knowing her for a couple of years now. So I'm very excited that she's here to talk about participation, grading participation. We have some folks online with us. I'm not sure how many are with us today, Alex?
Right now we have two, Dave Keenan and that's Cal.
Excellent. Hi, Dave. Hi, Nancy. So I feel like I'm doing a podcast on Facebook where people stop and say, hi, Dave. Hi, Nancy. Anyway, I'm going to leave it to Cosette to entertain everyone and to give us new things to think about. Thanks, Cosette.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. Should I stay close to the mic?
You can move around a bit.
I can move around? Okay. It looks like a pretty powerful mic. It reminds me of Elvis, actually.
You can start singing the blues anytime.
Oh, I hope we're not singing the blues. As Diane warmly introduced me, I'm Cosette Lemelin. Please call me Cosette. What would I like you to know about me? Well, I'd like you to know that I have been teaching for 20 years this year, which is a good amount of time. 15 of those years have been in post-secondary education. I'd like you to know that I worked most of that time at the University of Manitoba before we moved to Alberta 2 years ago, and I started working at the University of Alberta. In my main role was to work with instructors who came from the health professions education. So I have spent a lot of time working with professionals who come from practice and are now learning to go from being really competent professionals in their field to learning how to teach students on campus. So I've really enjoyed that role, and since we moved to Alberta and I'm at the U of A, I'm often sent to work with the professional faculties, healthcare professions fields, engineering, business, to help, as I say, competent professionals learn how to connect with their students. And so I'm very pleased to talk about participation today and how we can, well, if we decide to use participation in our classroom and grade it, then what's the best way to go about it, and what are some of the sort of philosophical considerations around giving students grades around participation? Before we get started, I'd like to do a quick warm-up task, and those of you who are online, I hope you don't mind bearing with me, and I'm just going to close this. That's a really big picture of me. And do a quick warm-up exercise just to get us into the spirit of things before we look at a couple of key questions. I often start a class using this warm-up, partly, to be honest with you, just between you and me, because it forces them to put their phones down. We get their hands out, and I get them to very quickly identify in 30 seconds. So while I'm talking, I'd like you to think about this yourself. I'd like you to think about, if you think about your thumb, what's something you do particularly well in your teaching? The index finger, the pointing finger, where are you going? Where would you like to be in your teaching? Or what would you like to get out of the session if you'd like to be more directive? Everybody has the middle finger for something they dislike. Okay, it can be a snowstorm in Edmonton, it can be something about teaching and learning, okay? The ring finger is someone or something that's really special to you. Everyone, I find, has a story about a student interaction or someone in their life that really was meaningful to them. And the pinky finger is something you're hoping for either today or in the near future. So, first thing that comes to mind, 5-finger warm-up, putting our phones down, turn to the person who's closest to you and share your hand. You have 2 minutes. Go. Those of you that are online, you're just going to spend a little bit of time thinking about this in more depth. Here's a copy of the warm-up.
Person.
Okay, well, we started.
Yes.
Where am I going?
I think it can be on his left.
How does it, where am I going?
Well, where are you going in your teaching learning, or it can be as simple as where are you going this week?
I'm teaching you how to do that I do.
I'm going into the area.
They'll pick something else.
Thing I dislike. I dislike. About your I just.
Yeah, I know. Here's something I dislike.
Amos.
I think the Peter's principle was funny. It was
I just someone special to me. Okay, that would be special. Someone special to me.
I have no idea. That's happening.
Let's leave it for today. Okay.
So we should be actually.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, 30 seconds left.
My middle name is something that I dislike. Yeah, and I don't think you decide. I actually, yeah, it's really.
Oh, so like you're
Oh, yeah.
So you get great. We're gonna start classes.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop you there. Here's what we're going to do next. I'm going to ask you, I would like you to introduce your partner. But because we have just a very short amount of time together, I'm going to ask you to tell us your partner's name and about one finger from your partner. So ask your partner what finger you are most comfortable having them introduce. So for example, I might say, this is my colleague Alex, who I met today, and then tell you about one of Alex's fingers. Okay? You have 30 seconds left to prepare that introduction of your partner.
Well, you're the only one who did this.
I know.
So I'll introduce you.
You can introduce me to this thing. And it's. So Sam, and I would make sure that is.
I would have told my like your car.
Yeah. I struggle with that.
You said that the last time, didn't you? I need to say you want to ask.
I struggle with very much.
I see.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to do our introductions in just a moment. One of the most important things I find about creating a classroom environment where participation can happen is to do a kind of warm-up at the beginning, not only of the first day of the course, but for the first 2 or 3 minutes of every class, so that we send the clear message that we participate in our classes. It may be something as simple or as silly as what I've got here, or it may be something more serious, like a quick problem, a review question from the previous class, something that gives you a sense of whether the students have done the readings. If you have trouble getting your students to class on time, because adult learners often have competing priorities, right? And any time they take to come to class is time they take away from something else in their life. In fact, that's why they often look at it. I will frequently post, I will usually arrive about 5 or 10 minutes before class at least, so I can interact with the students, and I will put a multiple choice or some sort of very short test question on the screen before I even put up my slides. And I will have that question up from 10 minutes before the start of the class until the start of the class. So students, as soon as they come in the room, they can look at my question. And then I take it down. This question may or may not appear on the next exam, but you must be present to win, to see that question, just like Vegas. So we have an understanding that you don't take pictures of the questions, you don't share the questions. Only those who come on time will get the extra practice question. So that, I find, helps get the students to class on time and is a little less harsh than locking the door. Okay? Right? Which with adult learners can go not that well, right? So it can go awry. All right. So let's hear some quick introductions before we get on to talking about participation in particular. So, Diane, who did you talk to?
So I have Sam here,
Okay.
and I have 2 fingers, but I think we'll choose the middle finger because he really dislikes students who are passive,
Okay.
who sit with their arms folded, not hearing what he has to say. He's quite enthusiastic about his subject, very knowledgeable, and feels sometimes that they're not hearing.
Yeah. We all have a few students who sit there and look at us like, I dare you to teach me something. Right? How do we work with those students? Good questions. Okay. And Sam?
Okay, I'm going to introduce Michael, and he's very good at interpreting information and data.
Michael, nice to meet you. Who did you talk to?
I talked to Diane. She tells me I need to come see her more often.
You do?
I see her every day. I don't know.
But we need to talk about teaching more often.
That's what it is.
She told me that too.
Well, she gave me the middle finger again, too, like she does it repeatedly. And that was in respect to she doesn't like to get up in the morning. So she has a really hard time with teaching early morning classes.
Yeah. So I'm much better at noon to 8 or 9.
You know that joke never fails? Somebody always says, I give the middle finger to something like that. Never fails. Or if you do this activity
So
with your students.
stereotypical, eh?
Yeah. All right.
I'm Kyle, and I got to talk to Tommy, and Tommy is very engaging with students, and he really jives well with his students.
Awesome, Tommy.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. Tell
At
us
least
about
I think so. Kyle, I like her ring finger because her special person is Paulo Freire. And he is one of my favorite people too. And so I like his educational theories.
Yes.
And so that's yeah, we can.
I lived in Brazil for 2 years, where Paulo Freire is from. And I can't read it in the original Portuguese. My Portuguese is not that good, but it's very interesting. That's where I started to get an interest in his work. Ken.
Hi, I'm Ken, and I spoke with Roseanne today, and her thumb is her most predominant appendage on her hand, and the reason she likes the thumb is that it relates to something she does well, and she really enjoys and works well with language students that are at the very lowest level in terms of those that are the most challenged to learn language, because she indicates that she too had difficulties learning languages, and so she knows how to reach those students.
Okay. Excellent, Roseanne. I have taught beginner ESL too at a Newcomer to Canada Center in Manitoba at the start of my career, and it made me very expressive with my hands and my face, and I got good at drawing, and I used to bring lots of stuff to the class. Tell us about Ken.
Okay, Kent would like me to talk about his pinky finger, and he hopes for a world that is more compassionate and aware of what's happening around us, so that people can work together and be a little more harmonious.
Excellent. Thank you, Kent. Thank you, Kent. Do you want to introduce yourselves with that?
I talked to Amanda. Something that she's very good at, I agree, is marshalling resources and developing processes. She is excellent at
Fantastic.
I met and spoke with Kim. She gives the middle finger to negativity. Power to positive.
Okay. I told you it doesn't get old.
Yeah. Both Brian and Amanda, and someone very special to them is the Leo team, which includes me. So it's pretty awesome.
Awesome. Well, that's good. Okay, Alex has told me that we don't have the mics for those of you who are listening in, but maybe we can talk over email about that another time. So here's what I wanted to focus on today. I've given each of you a handout with what I consider the 7 most integral questions. Like I have about 45 minutes with you, and I wanted to get at the meat of this topic. So here's another participation strategy I use in class with my students. We all put up learning objectives for here's what we're going to do today in class. What if, either in addition to or instead of learning objectives, you said, here's the questions we're going to answer in class today. And you made the students participate in answering those questions as a way of taking notes. Now, in terms of this topic, I thought it was really important when you think about why we grade participation, how much should participation be worth? Should it be a 5% kind of thing? Should it be a 40% kind of thing? Anything in between or above? How do we do this when our classes are big, right? A big class for extension is how many students?
Can be 75.
That's a big class.
That's
Yeah.
online.
Yeah, that's online.
Still, that's lots of people to manage in terms of the teaching and learning. How do you give assessment on participation? Or why might you want to give assessment on participation during the course of the course, or do you just give it at the end, right? How do you keep track when there's 75 students? And what do we do with students who are not naturally outgoing, who are very shy and introverted? So here's what we're going to do for the first 10 minutes. You are experts in your own experience as educators. So what I'm going to get you to do is cluster around the questions that are most important to you as an educator. I have 2 copies of each of these questions on the cards that you see around the room. So if you think that question number 1, the philosophical, why do we even grade participation, is what you really want to start talking about the most today, go to that question cluster with people who want to talk about that, okay? If it so happens you're the only one at this question, there is another one on the room. We can always double up our groups. Wasn't sure how many people are coming. But I'm going to give you 10 minutes to mill to the different questions around the room and share a few ideas before I start sharing some of my experiences and best practices with you. All right? So there's 1 copy of each of the questions on this side, 1 copy on this side. If we find that there's only 1 or 2, then we'll just group up on this side of the room. All right? Any doubts, questions, worries about what we're doing next? You choose a question and most of you sue and go to that question. Take your 10 minutes with you. Go ahead. You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes to get there?
To mill around the question.
Okay, let's
And you can, if you want to go to a few questions, you can. If you just want to go to one, you can.
I am.
Okay.
Which number are you?
Number 4, how do I grade? Yeah, number 4.
4 is interesting. Class 4.
You have 4? You have 4 too?
Yes.
Which one? Okay, you want to come over here?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Free.
Are you joining me? Okay.
I am.
I was looking forward to
Anybody interested in free?
Michael, no. We'll get there. Metaphorically speaking.
Well, I have on mine, I guess
Actually, I don't know what's my every now and then meditation, my specialty, and the teapot. Yeah. I was just checking. I wish more people coming in online. I wish I could engage in.
Well, that's the thing, it's just, you get just data. So it's just a performance criteria. It's not an outcomes
The way
based.
that I created.
All right, so in my case, I have done most
What I used to do,
online.
when I was,
So
I
in
was
fact,
doing,
who's participating is
I
actually
would ask the
quite
students to
easy.
respond to
In the
a
sense that
question
there's
that I
analytics.
put on the board online.
But even
they
then,
would have,
I recognize that the technology tells me when they log on,
Move forward.
what they're doing, they go back to doing
and
anything.
put their answers on.
And
And then
so what I will do is I will
or maybe we do it the night before. Then
have,
we'll
do a
go back.
self-reflection as part of their participation.
I would see,
And often,
who responded,
I've
and
actually
try
had
to
assignments where they had to take
But
somebody
at
in
the end
their
of the
class,
I would,
and then they had like third, and then
all of
grade it
those
for me.
responses, and let's say there were 150.
So I asked them to say, tell me,
Let's say there were 100
based on
possible
communication
responses. So
and
if you
detail
responded to the
connection
90,
to the material.
you
Rank
responded
yourself out
90
of 5.
times.
Say 2 out of 5, 5 out of 5, 3 out of 5.
Times.
That adds up to
To let 90
15.
So,
Ask them into their sometimes they over limited themselves. Like I think they're actually
just because, you
sometimes they're like
you get an A, if you were.
so I use it as a way,
Missed your opportunities.
but it keeps them on top of it. If they know at some point they want something they read.
They go,
Oh,
that's
and
I'd say, well,
So you get them to write
unless you
something.
go back and do your responses by
And then that becomes part of the answer. So I look at their assessment, and their reflection of their participation, and then that allows me to sort of say, well, I think you're right, I can respond to this. That's exactly what happened. Or I'll look at them and say, you know, I think your contribution more than what I actually see. And then sometimes like it's like, yeah, you see where you come from this, and you said that I had some issues. So I'm going to read your book. So it gives them a way to recognize that participation
And let's say
and then ultimately, not just a free text. So they have to set aside really focusing on what they're saying and how they're saying it. Justifying it. The other thing that I'll do is this is so I'll get them to do a small something as part of participation, something like that. Something I would use as a module. And then at the end of the module, I'll have them do one. Tell me what they really different from the moment they assess. And so that allows them as well to then not only see that they are studying in module 2, but they learn something extra. If they didn't know that shows up in there.
So there may be a forum that their homework is to do.
So those kinds of things keep them
Being an
from.
online class, being online class, big summer. I just like switch over every hour or two.
And some adults can care less, so they just let
But
you.
yeah, on a face-to-face class,
It allows them to have some control over how they're graded for their presentation. And then I'll often, because of this, get an email from a student, and they'll say something like, I'm really sorry I was absent this week. I never noticed. So they'll say, I'm sorry I was absent this week. So
could you use that
Okay, we're about halfway. If you want to switch, you could switch. We're about halfway through our time.
just done like that.
So you can use that as a way to get one more. The other thing that I like is what's called exit slips, which is used in a regular classroom. So in an exit slip at the end of the day, you would have them answer your questions and then do it anonymously. Those three things, when you see there's been a big answer in the series, you can start the lecture in 5 minutes. So I have these 4 questions that people had trouble with yesterday. 2 of them will be dealt with later today, but today I want to answer these 2. That shows them that things that by participating in the answers that you're listening. You're hearing the problems that are you said it's 1 minute or.
What didn't connect with you? And no, they won't. What about people go? That's good. Generally, they don't. And obviously.
They don't, but if you're given an anonymous sheet of paper in the back, and I've got a bunch of questions, what's the thing you learned most today? What's the thing that you and then they just fill them in as though it doesn't matter, they're okay. But if they write something, then they'll address it the next morning.
It's not really.
It is, because the people who are in the room are participating, even though not everyone is. But you can't say your name's optional if you want to.
I need to give this a wiggle once in a while. Do I give this a wiggle once in a while so it doesn't disappear on me?
So you're over here. So that way, if they're right there, you can stop. But on the other hand, you could start the next class with something like this. That's not as helpful as I would like it to be. Maybe you could find that. So I can do that. Or you said, right, so again, you still talk to somebody. You talk to somebody. So you talk to them, you are paying attention.
The guy is going to come and break some knees.
I have a statement. I walks off. That's just a couple of things.
I do what you said, everything is easy. At the end of each month, I ask
Well, one of the things that
if they're, if they didn't understand, they'll give it to somebody else. And the girls, we have some of these tasks. This was, I didn't, we did. And then they go,
Okay, 1 more minute.
they're eating from computers and stuff.
Somebody.
Yeah, that's excellent. So, there's.
I did ask them, you asked them who are.
That's always been a challenge. Because
So there's ways of getting more Yeah, look at this, you're a victim of participation.
What's that?
I said you're a victim, your talk is a victim of participation.
I like that everybody's participating.
That's good.
Yeah. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop you there. My goal for the next, my goal for the next 27 minutes is to make sure we have each of these questions answered and you have some strategies for working with your students. So let's start with the first question. You can stay where you are if you like, or you can move, it doesn't matter. Why grade participation? I'm going to ask our group for at least 2 responses. Who can give me the first response? Why grade participation?
There's no desire on behalf of the student to participate if they're not being graded on.
There are some students who do think if I'm not getting a grade for it, I don't want to do it. How do we work with those students?
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Can you repeat the question, because the people on the other end won't be able to hear you?
Sure.
So they won't hear us.
Okay.
They'll hear me because I have a voice, but with my quiet colleagues here, they won't hear.
Okay.
So we need to repeat.
Okay.
And Alex might have some questions as well.
Okay, excellent. That's good for me to know for process. So the first question I asked was, why grade participation? And Amanda responded, the first response was, well, if we don't give them a participation grade, then they won't be motivated to participate. Another idea. Yes?
It is a measure of engagement of the students, or it can be, if the engagement is really deeper at a certain level.
Okay. As a measure of engagement was the second response. So when I work with instructors on different campuses, what they often tell me is that they want to grade participation, number one, to get the students to class. If you give them marks in class, that's how they earn their marks, by getting them to class, okay? Instructors often tell me it encourages them to actively participate. And in some cases, if you want to do activities in class, it encourages them to come to class prepared. Now, I'm going to encourage us to aim even higher, because the research tells us that, and you can tell your students this, if students participate, they learn more. The evidence is pretty conclusive on that. The more you participate, the more you learn. Michael and I were saying at the beginning of class, you get out of it what you put into it. And if you are going to be a professional in a particular field, or you're going to improve your English with Roxanne, the more you put into it, the better your English is going to be. Or if you just sit back passively in a business meeting and you don't contribute, then you're not likely going to be a successful business professional.
But the actual assumption on the part of students that nothing you are going to do is going to be worth their attending unless they get grades for it actually says a very, very horrible thing about our state of teaching. It also, I think, to some extent says a lot about how we prepare students up to the point where they're adults and they recognize perhaps that they need to do this and they need to come to these classes because it makes them a better employee or gives them more skills for promotion or whatever. But if we're actually working in a system that actually says, show up and we'll participate you, and grade you, or don't show up because there's nothing here for you to see, that's a really sad thought in terms of teaching and learning, because I know from past experience, when students are enthusiastic, you can tell them you got participation grades till the cows come home, and they're there because they're really enthusiastic about the subject, or you've created a learning environment that's really exciting. So how do we measure though? How do we match those two ideas? Because for me, it's really, the question I would be asking myself as a teacher is, if my students only come because of participation grades, what am I doing wrong?
I think that that's a really good question to ask. But I also think that you have to give that question back to the students and say, if the only reason you're coming to class is to get grades, are you in the right class? Right? Are you following the right path? if that's the measure of your enthusiasm for this subject, are you in the right place? Because not everyone is meant to be a business professional, and maybe it's not the right moment to be improving whatever your subject area is. So I don't think it's entirely on the shoulders of the instructor.
No, I think you're right.
Yeah, and I think you can say with some authority and I'm telling you with the research behind you that we know that if we expect students to do things like cultivate critical thinking, logic and reasoning skills, respect and professionalism in this culture, for instance, where we think about Roxanne's students who are coming from different parts of the world, then they have to participate, right? There are just some things that you have to learn through participation. And if you are at the point of bargaining with the students, please come and I'll give you some marks, then it's not entirely on you. That's my feeling as an educator. I think that if we reward them, to follow Diane's comment, if we reward them just for showing up, I think we are setting a pretty low standard, right? Too low a standard, I would argue, right? I wrote a little article about this that was published in the Quad over at the U of A campus, and it was called Participation Grades, Thanks for Coming. And it was addressing just this thing, if you want to pull it up. So any other comments about grading participation and why we might do it? Yeah, Alex.
We got a comment online from Sean who says it helps to encourage students to participate with their classmates and to build social skills. Planning involves land and people, and you can't master both.
Great, absolutely.
What was that last thing you said?
Sean does land use planning, so you need both being able to participate with classmates and to build social skills in order to be a good land use planner.
Okay. So number 2, I noticed no one clustered around number 2. So is it all right if I just take on number 2? Okay.
Well, can I add something to the wide grade participation thing?
Absolutely.
Because I think another sort of maybe slightly more noble reason to do it is so that it can be formative for planning.
Yes.
What you're going to do. So it gives you an insight into their thinking about what you're trying to engage them with, and so you grade it just to be able then to use it and think about it, and it can affect. So you can see that they're being engaged, and then you can then use that again to further engage.
Yes. And some of our students may never have been in a classroom they've been asked to participate before, right? Many of your learners may have been in a very traditional school setting where their role as a student was to sit and listen. Whether they're coming from a different country or whether they just haven't been in school for quite a while. So they have to relearn how to be a student in the classroom in 2018. Because some of the young people coming out of high schools now have had this type of learning before. It's not entirely new to them. And they are learning how to be in a lecture of 200 students back over at the other campus, for example. And they're confused in the opposite direction. So some of this is about saying, this is how important it is in my classroom and in your learning. And this is the type of teacher I am. So that's why a grade gives a currency to it. How much of a grade should you give? Well, it is ultimately, the most direct answer is I've seen everything from 5 to about 40%. Okay? But here's the key question. What is the purpose of your course? When you are either given a course, you take on a course, you create a course, you have these objectives or learning outcomes, call them whatever you call them. But you have a reason why your course exists. And there's reasons for, what is the purpose of this week in the course, right? When you look at those reasons for the course existing, the outcomes or the objectives, how many of those are related to social skills, as our colleague online mentioned? How many of those are related to communication? How many of those are related to highly interactive knowledge or skills or attributes, right? That's how you're going to decide how much your participation grade can reasonably be worth. For example, if I'm in a graduate type seminar, if I'm in a seminar where students are doing tons of participation, then that warrants as much as 30 or 40%, right? But if it's a class of mostly I'm sharing knowledge and content with you, and students giving an occasional response and putting up their hand and doing minimal group work, well, maybe it's closer to that 5% then, right? So making a decision about how much the participation should be worth should really depend on what is being accomplished by your course. Kent?
There's two aspects of participation like everything. There's the reward part of it.
Yeah.
And there's the motivation part of it.
Mm-hmm.
They're two very different objectives. You may get a lot of participation in that you want to reward, but you don't want to motivate any more participation. If you've got enough graduate seminars, you've got a lot of participation.
Yep.
So you may want to reward that, but you actually want more. So the ideas of reward and motivation are often at cross purposes with one another. And oftentimes when we do something, when we put a spotlight on something,
Yep.
we want people to actually be motivated to do that. So if we give more marks for participation, are we doing that to reward what we actually want, or are we doing that as a way of motivating people to give even more? So I think you have to separate in your mind what you want, what participation is to you in terms of as something you want to fortify by rewarding them to get to a particular level, or is it something you actually want to motivate people to actually get more of?
Yes.
You don't get enough of it, and it has to be more of it.
There's a third aspect to that as well, and that is, as you pointed out, the skill set. How much of it is a skill set? So if you even, and I appreciate the, sort of big lecture theater, 200, 5% versus 40% for the graduate studies. But I can think of a lot of courses, even in the undergraduate program, where part of their reason for being is that they are actually trying to teach a skill set. And part of that skill set is the ability to engage, participate, argue, synthesize out loud, just to be part of the process. So it's both intrinsic and extrinsic, but then it's also, there's a skill level to it as well that you don't want somebody graduating from an undergraduate degree or graduate degree in communication and not able to actively communicate.
Yes, and I think that if you've got a 5% participation, then your criteria for that 5% is going to be we're moving on to question 3, is going to be very different than that criteria for something that's worth 30 or 40%, right? If the 5% might just motivate them to come to class and put up their hand.
5% won't motivate, 40% will motivate. See, if you give too little,
yes,
it becomes something that is not all that important. It may be a reward for that in terms of I know what I have to do to get the 5%, but 5% is insufficient to motivate.
Okay.
40% on the other hand may not, I mean, it has a...
That incurs resentment. Because then they just come for that reason, and they say, I'm getting 40% of my grade is just showing up. And then they see through that right away.
Well,
I like what Diane said about skill. Many students don't know how to participate. They don't know what it means to be a participator, and they're reluctant to. Like some students I've had, they just don't. So, and I've had teachers who will say, "That's what you mean. That's what I mean by participation. That's what you need to do." And a lot of times you'll say to the students, "Okay, now here's what's going to happen. Now you're going to participate. This is what I expect you to do." And otherwise, they just sit there.
Exactly.
I'm participating. I'm participating.
A couple of thoughts to follow this up. You know your students best. So Kent is going to know what motivates his students and what doesn't motivate his students. 5% might motivate some of my students, but not motivate some of yours. So there is some wisdom from your own experience in the classroom. At the same time, I think that you've struck a very important point, and that is, Michael, that you have to give them clear criteria for what is that participation. And I brought some examples today of how you are going to assess the participation. Because what typically happens with participation grades is we have good reasons for wanting to use it, but then we're very loosey-goosey about sort of how are we actually going to decide what participation grades some students get. And that gets us into trouble as a teacher. It really can. Because the students can say, well, how did you arrive at that? And so I think if you want to not only get the students to class and set the bar higher, I think that you have to have some kind of form of assessment. Pass these along as quick as I can, yeah? For participation. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. There's one example on one side and a different example on the opposite side. So in one of your very first classes with your group, one strategy that you may consider trying is, especially if you've got higher participation grades, right? And I'm talking 20% or more. You have to give them a pretty clear standard of what that participation is, as you said. Because we want to develop those skills, as Diane said. And we want them to know exactly what it means to get good participation marks. I won't go through this in detail. If you had questions about it, I'll provide my email address at the end. But these are two examples of rubrics that you might use, adapt, develop, pull apart, create your own, for how you can explain to students how you would arrive at a participation mark. Yes.
I was just going to say as well, one of the reasons for using rubrics, both in assessing student participation and in sort of other activities that you've created in the class, is that it really does give students an understanding of the path, but it also, funny enough, solidifies the content that you want them to focus in on in terms of the skill set and so on. So it's often really useful because it will give students a sort of an at-a-glance of your teaching intentions fundamentally. Because if this is how you're going to assess, then this must mean that these things are important to how I craft my answer to your question.
Yeah, the bottom line, it says it's really a lot more than just showing up. These are the criteria by which I am assessing your participation. These are what I'm looking for. And I'll often go back to this criteria. For example, if a group has worked particularly well or someone's asked a particularly insightful question, I would say, oh, that's a great example of this category and participation rubric as a way of reinforcing that behavior within class. Yes?
I think it's a related question.
Yeah.
I have had group assignments, and interestingly, we all work in teams and groups, or most of us do, and everybody hates that kind of assignment with passion. And the feedback is, well, I did all the work, and yet you're giving the marks to all these other people. So this next go-around, there's actually a part of the course is on group and teamwork.
Yes.
So I'm assigning that as a group and teamwork assignment. And I love your rubric, the A+ through F, as a way of giving it to the students and saying, okay, mark your colleagues. And give me a portion of the group assignment mark would be based on
Peer assessment.
Peer assessment. I would call it participation assessment. But then am I double marking them on participation? And does that matter?
Well, I think that the students can assign other students grades. We can't do that. But you can use the input from the students to help you decide the grade that you, the instructor, assign.
Okay.
So any information you get from the students is data for you to help assign those participation grades.
So I would approach that by something like
fill out the following, as part of your group work, you fill out this peer review.
Yeah.
I will use this peer review, coupled with all of the other members of the team. I will use this for the group participation. I will
Yeah.
use this to inform me as to how I grade.
Yes.
So it's not double grade.
But the question also is, how do you gather that participation data that you're going to rank up in 70, 80, 90, and so forth?
This
Do you stand up there and say, okay, right now, I'm doing your participation group?
Yeah.
And you look around the room and everybody who's
No.
not asleep
No.
gets an A.
No, I think that trying to collect that kind of quantifiable data can be really stressful. Even if you try to focus on a certain quadrant
but
of the
then it
group or
becomes-
certain people.
Super subjective.
I agree with you.
I thought about you last night and you didn't look like you were participating, so,
I agree.
F to you.
Okay, so let's get on to a few different ways that we can collect participation data. Yes?
So going reflection, I have a spreadsheet with just tick boxes. So one tick means that they actually did this in class, and a circle means that they didn't do this. At the end of the term, I just roll and count my ticks and my zeros, and then I give them a score.
How many students do you have?
18.
Okay, that.
So, and then it's walking around when they do their current events, when they do their team projects, when they do their novel discussions. So, and they see me walking.
Yes.
So they know that I'm looking for, that they've done their outline, they know that I'm listening for active listeners.
Yes.
They know that I'm listening for certain things, I'll put it on the board, I'm listening for this today, I better hear it,
Well,
and I do.
couple thoughts.
But that's how I put the tick sheet, very, very fast.
It works very well with small groups, but then the response, I like that. I like that it works with a small group. Let me just add one thought to that. The other thought to that is that it's all on you, right? It's all on Roxanne to be making those judgments. So a couple more suggestions for strategies, all right? At the beginning of every term, I will often have students I will have them set participation goals for themselves. And so I have an example of what that might look like here. Diane's going to hand that out for you. So I have my students set participation goals. It can be how often they raise their hand in class. It can be working with group members. It can be not using their phone. Whatever you happen to have in your rubric or what you've established as a standard for participation in your class. Those goals, 2 or 3 goals, and then they hand those goals in. Midway through the term, I have students write me a very short paragraph, maybe even an email if that's easier, saying, are you meeting your participation goals? How could you improve? As a way of making them have a sense of responsibility for those participation goals. Something else that might really work is, you mentioned you're doing group work. Here's a group contract where the students are also responsible for keeping track and collecting information on their participation. I think it's important to make students aware of their participation and to get them to give you data on how they feel they're progressing with their participation. So although Roxanne's strategy is really useful, I would say that it's all on Roxanne, and it could also be on the students as well to help shape some of the data on the participation. So on a discussion board, that could be handed into you individually. It doesn't have to, it can be done on index cards in a large class. It could be done over an email. But I think that your question about keeping track of who participates, I think that you have to tell the students the ways in which you're keeping track of their participation. So Roxanne is very clear with her students. I'm going to come around, I have a spreadsheet, I'm keeping track. I'm checking on you, right? But I also tell the students, you know, not everyone participates in the same way. So if you send me a question after class, if you stay after class and ask me a question. Those are good examples of participating too. If you are the spokesperson on behalf of your group or the note taker on behalf of your group and group activities, and then you have an opportunity to hand that in or send a screenshot to your instructor, those are the ways of participating too. So then not only your loudest students are getting all of the participation marks, which is sometimes a concern with participation grades. I just want to check, given the time, which one I haven't talked about.
For what it's worth, we had some interest online in number 7. Yeah, how we get participation marks to Shire Trade students.
Yes. Okay. Well, I will work with students, whether it's a discussion board online, or whether it's a Google Doc in class, or whether it's a piece of poster paper, right? I will say, those of you who are a little shy about participating, I want you to take the role of the note taker, or I want you to take the role of writing down the questions or raising questions online, so that it's, as I said, not always the loudest student. As well, sometimes in the participation rubric for group work, I'll have a category for things like technical skills or editing skills. Those things are often not talked about, but are participating, right? If someone spends all the time reformatting the presentation on behalf of the students, that's participating. If the students are the one who did a lot of the editing on the group project, then that's participating. So I try to include lots of different types of participation in my participation rubric, and then I look for it in class, and I let the students know that I'm looking for it.
Can I suggest something as well that
Yeah.
I found works? I use exit cards.
Mhm.
So I will offer 3 questions at the end of each lecture or class, and I will sort of say to students, these are anonymous. If you want them to be anonymous, I'm happy to have the questions asked without your name attached. If you'd like them to be part of participation, just simply put your name attached to them.
Yeah.
Now that does cause a bit of an issue because they might not ask me the same question they would ask anonymously, but if it's done over 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 days, then sometimes they'll have a question they'd like to have attached to their participation, but sometimes they have a question that they'd like not to attach to their name because it's a sensitive question, and so therefore they can pass it in the next day without penalty or feeling like I'm going to give them some difficulty, which I wouldn't anyway, but
Right.
they might still feel that way.
Right. The last suggestion that wasn't addressed with all of the question I'll just make now before I take any questions you might have is that I think one of the other messages that comes out of these questions I've given you is how often do you assess participation? And I'm recommending that you give students some feedback on their preparation, on their, sorry, I'm rushing now, you see, on their participation at least once over the course of the term, so that they don't get a participation grade at the very end of the course and it's like, surprise, you now have nothing you can do to improve that participation grade.
So maybe midterm?
At least midterm. I try to get instructors to do it a couple of times, and I have either students send me a comment about their participation in the course that I respond to, so that it's not all on me. If you are able to keep track, like Roxanne, you can let them know the tally, the total, to that point. Okay? But I try to get the students to take some responsibility, or the group members to take some responsibility for how is your group, or how are you individually progressing with your participation, at least a couple of times before I assign that final grade, so we can have a dialogue about that. Yes?
I think one of the things that we're up against in continuing professional education is that we're teaching a 21-hour course.
Yes.
It's 3 days in a row, or 2 days, 2 days. So if they get there, if they don't start participating first right out of the bucket,
Yep.
they're not gonna, you don't have 7 weeks to get them going,
Yep.
or 15 weeks.
Yep.
You gotta get them going right now. And if they're having to leave their office that's working on a big project, and then they show up in your class, they're gonna be on their phone, or they're gonna be pulled in those directions. That's not gonna go away by the end of the class. 3 days from now, they're still gonna be, it's difficult in that highly compressed environment of CPE.
Yes, I appreciate what you're saying. I think you have to point out good examples of participation with your learners. I think at the end of each of your 3 days, you have to have a little debrief with them about their participation. I also recommend that you look at your lesson plan for the day and say, in that day, where are the most important things happening and where will there be a no phone zone? All right, for the next 10 minutes, no phones. All right, the next chance for you to check the phone will be at this time. But for the next 10 minutes, I need your undivided attention. And if you warn them that's coming, and then I need you here for those 10 or 15 minutes, and then if you want to quickly check your phone after, give them a 2-minute technology break, and then go back into what you're doing. I found that I can work with busy professionals that way. I've rushed at the end, and I'm sorry about that. There is so much to say. Do you have any questions?
Good, thank you so much.
Okay, bye. We got through all the questions in one way or another, just not in the same order we sent them out in.
Many thanks to Cosette for her presentation. I think Brian has a couple of things he wants to say.
No, just thanks very much for coming, everybody, and people online as well. The recording will be posted.
Yeah, we're going to record the posting, post the recording. And we'll also...
Your colleagues and others that might be interested in Cosette is great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll also make sure that the handouts are available, and I also wanted to remind people that we have one more workshop in the series, which is in April. So it's the date and time and place are in the newsletter, and it's on open educational resources. So if you've always wondered where you can get materials for your students that don't cost an arm and a leg, cause them great distress, we can help with open educational resources, and that will be run by Krista McNutt out of CTL as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.